Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our, I think it's our 16th live stream. Anyway, it's the July live stream. And this one, we're back to the usual format of answering questions that we've been asked relatively recently and sent to our support team. We're also going to answer any questions you've got in the chat and talk a little bit about a few of the changes in the new releases of Forest Pack and RailClone, which were just updates, but there are a few things in there that might have passed people by, so it's worth mentioning them and going over them just to make sure that everyone's got the latest info. If you want to say hello to us in the chat, please feel free. If you want to ask any questions in the chat, please feel free. And Jaime, who's next to me, will be on the chat answering your questions and feeding any to me that we feel like would benefit from being discussed live on air. So, I don't know if you've got anything to add, Jaime?
It's buenas tardes from southern Spain. I hope you guys are having a great summer. Let's kick it.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to start off by looking at the latest RailClone updates. And there are a few things here that are worth mentioning. There are a few that don't really need demonstrating. They're just worth mentioning in case they passed you by. So, for example, we improved the performance of the latest update of RailClone. And compared to RailClone 5, it's now up to 5 times faster when evaluating very large styles. So if you've ever tried things like the parametric library, our big buildings collection, which is quite a complex graph, it's about 5 times faster evaluating those graphs. So it's a big speed boost. And for those users that like to use adaptive display mode, which is the display mode whereby it degrades to boxes automatically if the poly count gets above a certain level, that's up to 10 times faster in this release. It was rewritten completely from the ground up to be a lot more efficient. So those are big changes, or bigger performance improvements. There are a couple of other smaller changes that I'll come back to, but one of them I wanted to mention because I think it's quite useful, but it is passing people by, I think, is just a couple of extra expressions in the code-based part of RailClone. I know it's not everyone's favourite part of RailClone, but I'm sure there are some advanced users here who do use it. And so I just wanted to point those out to you. So basically what we've got now is the ability to have some awareness of a segment of the size of the adjacent sections on a spline. So if we look at this spline here, and go into vertex mode, you can see there are 3 sections of this spline here, and this section here after the arrow is currently smaller than the one on the other side. And if I make this a bit larger, you'll see at some point this arrow will flip. So what this is basically doing is it's always pointing towards the smallest adjacent spline section. Now I could do it the other way around and have it always pointed towards the largest as well, of course. That'd just be a case of flipping the selector operator up here. So this is quite handy. It basically means that this objects in this part of the spline now know how big this part of the spline is and how big this part of the spline is. And I just want to show you how you use that, how you'd set up this basic system up, and show you the 3 types of expression you've now got for evaluating the size of spline sections. So first of all, the things we already knew we had are the ability to find the existing spline section. We could, for example, use that to scale this arrow to fit into the spline section on which it currently sits. And the way you would do that would be to go into arithmetic, wire into the x fixed size in this case, and open the expression editor. Now, as we know, we don't actually need to remember any of these expressions because they're all listed on the left hand side for you. So what we want to come down to is find the one that we want, which is x section length. So this isn't new, this has been here a while. And if I just evaluate that, you can see that arrow now scales to fit into that spline section. So no big deal. So you can see that's what's happening there. Now, what we can also do is to interrogate the sides of that. So what we might have here is a selector C, and I've got the arrow fed into a mirror operator. So in this selector, I've got the ability to switch the arrow from one side to the other, basically. And I would do that using another expression. So what I can do is to wire that into there, change the expression, hit type return as always, and then I'm going to set up a a conditional statement. So I'm going to type if, open the brackets, and then I want to type the condition I'm going to test for. So that's going to be x section, next length. Is that smaller than x section previous length? So this is the new one. And if it is, I'll output 1. And if it's not, I'll output 2. Close the brackets, semicolon, and hit evaluate. So now what should happen is I should see a change when the size of these segments switches. So as always with Zoom and my streaming software and everything else running, my computer behaves very slow. So please forgive the fact that Max is appearing a bit sluggish for me. But you can see now that's working. So it's now pointing towards the smallest side once again. So that's basically how you set those up. Those are the things to look out for in that version of RailClone. If I come over to here, we can see perhaps an application of that. So here I've got a door in a room and I've put the door on markers. And what I can do now, thanks to that, is I could, for example, always have the door so that it's opening towards the nearest wall. So you see as I drag that across, at some point it will switch to make sure it always opens to the nearest wall. So that's one of the possible applications for this kind of thing. It can be kind of more context sensitive, and you can build styles that are more aware perhaps of their surroundings than you've been able to do before, which is quite handy. Another thing that I wanted to mention while I've got this here is, actually I'll go back to the other graph, it's just a bit easier to understand, is the ability to well, I'm going to remind people about the ability to copy and paste macros, which is a very helpful part of RailClone 6. So if I wanted to create a macro from this little graph that I've just created that changes the arrow's direction, then all I need to do now is copy it, add a macro node, double click on it and paste it in. And that immediately is very straightforward. You can see there's my macro there. And the only thing I'd need to add is an output to that because it hasn't got an output. So I just come into here and add an output. And we need to tell it what type of thing to output, but that's already okay. It's a segment. Now we can replace all of this graph with that macro. So that ability to copy and paste was introduced with RailClone 6. What we've introduced in this update we just released a week or so ago is the ability to password protect this macro. So that didn't exist before. It was requested by our users, possibly some watching this stream. And basically what you can do now is you can come into here, you can go up to the macro menu, and you can hit protect by password and type a password. Hit OK. Then the next time you try and open that macro, you'll be prompted for a password. So this is great for, whoops, a daisy. This is great for people who want to distribute macros, but they don't necessarily want people to have access to the graph or to fiddle with the graph. Or if you're in a studio and you are responsible for macros and you don't want people to be able to accidentally break them in some way, then you could password protect it. But I say it was requested by users, so we implemented it. Let me just find all my various things again. Okay, I think RailClone updates wide, that was about it. There were a couple of other small things in that release that are probably worth mentioning, but by all means check out our blog post. So I did one small thing. It's such a small thing, but I do find it already very useful. If this graph here is not the graph that relates to whatever you've currently got selected in the scene, then you'll find this little icon in the top left-hand corner goes red. Right, so that means I'm using a graph, but it's not currently selected, that RailClone object. And I think people probably spotted that. What may have passed people by was if you do actually want to select that RailClone object, you can click on that button, and then it will select the RailClone object in the scene for you. So you've now selected the corresponding RailClone object that relates to this graph that we've got here. So that's a kind of handy little tip. Cool. Sorry, Jaime, I think I cut you off there as you were saying.
Yeah, no, sorry, my fault. I did cut you actually. We have an interesting Forest Pack question.
Ooh, okay.
And then we have Alpha Canal requesting Windows presets. Again, assets is something that's on the radar for this year. We have a single guy in the team, a new guy in the team working exclusively on it. It's on the roadmap. We don't have deadlines yet, but main goal right now is to revamp all the included libraries in RaiClone. But yeah, we can say that Windows, it's in the radar, in the roadmap. No deadline yet.
Yeah, thank you, Jaime.
Yeah.
So the question is about scattering large volumes of grass, right? That still look good.
Yeah.
I find scattering bunches of grass made for big areas looks, I can't see that because it's behind your head. Let me move that. Looks much worse than scattering single plants. Then I've ended limits. I mean, yeah, scattering sort of 50 to 1 meter patches of grass is still the recommended way for us. There's not a way of still scattering individual plants. What I would say with that though is that don't just scatter one patch, make multiple patches of grass, and with those multiple patches have different probabilities of mixes of those plants in there, and then use clustering when you scatter the patches. And then what you'll end up with in the large areas, rather than a kind of uniform look for your grass, you can still end up with interesting mosaic of plant types in your patches. So that's probably the best way to do it still currently, I would say. Yeah. Great. Anything else? I don't think so, looking at that. Okay. So, Forest Pack updates. So, Forest Pack, we also released a couple of small updates there, but there might be a couple of bits and pieces that passed you by. And I also wanted to mention a couple of things just about the libraries and how you can build your Forest Pack library using assets from other collections. So I'm just going to show you that quickly. I'm just going to reset my scene and then switch back to desktop. Okie dokie. So I think everyone is probably aware that RailClone Forest Pack has a library, but I just wanted to show you how you can create your own, and still we're getting a lot of questions which refer to the old way of creating Forest Pack libraries, where you'd have to create a separate max file and then go through Forest Library and kind of import the max file, choose the objects, build the materials, and so on and so forth. It is much easier since a couple of versions of Forest Pack ago. You can just basically copy stuff directly from the scene into the Forest Pack library. And what we've also done is added support for various other objects in the Forest Pack library. So we now support forest LODs and forest sets, which is what I want to show you now. But on top of that, as a kind of a little bonus, I wanted to show you that if you, for example, use Chaos Cosmos assets, then there's nothing to, first of all, there's nothing to stop you using Chaos Cosmos assets directly in Forest Pack. Basically, all of this is fair game. You can use any of these in Forest Pack. And of course, there's a few ways you can do that. So you could just import them into the scene, and I'll just wait for this to take place. So apologies, my computer is behaving a little slowly. And just while I'm waiting for that to happen, yeah, so any of this is fair game. We've already downloaded these. It was supposedly to save time, but this is still taking some time. And we can just use these in Forest Pack just by selecting them and adding them to the geometry list. So that's very easy to do, no problem at all. If you find, however, that you use the same assets from Chaos Cosmos repeatedly, there is a quicker way of doing this, which might be to add these Chaos Cosmos assets to the Forest Pack library so that you can put them directly into the geometry list from within Forest Pack, and it saves a few steps. Right? It saves you having to go into Cosmos and doing what I'm doing now. It saves you having to then import it, then create the forest object, and then click add, and then select it from the scene, and so on and so forth. So what we can do is directly port that stuff over. I'm just going to do a couple because it is behaving very slowly. Okay, so we've got one asset there. Let's bring one more in just for luck. I've got two. Two is fine. Two's enough to demonstrate. Okay. So here's my two trees. Obviously, I can select those. I can create a forest object And here's a little option here that people might not be aware of, populate from selection, which basically, if I've got that turned on and something selected, when I create a new Forest Pack object, it will automatically add whatever I had selected to the geometry list. So if that's on, that's a quick way of adding things to a new Forest Pack object. But what I wanted to show you was that I could take these two trees and add them to a Forest Pack library if I want. So let me just show you this. Once the Max interface catches up with me. Okie dokie. So there you can see those two things were automatically added to the geometry list. So that's just a quick tip on creating forest objects if you've got things in the scene. Of course, you can also just click plus and select them from the scene. So there I'm using Chaos Cosmos assets in Forest Pack. No problem at all. Easy enough. Now I don't need Forest Pack open to do this. So let's say I've got these two live plants and I know I'm going to use them a lot. I want to add them to the Forest Pack library. So what you can do is just select them, both. Click on the button up here to open the Forest Pack library editor. And this does not need Forest Pack object in the scene to open it or to add new objects to it. So it just works fine. And then, oh, hello, we crashed. Let me just come back to the chat screen for a minute while I reboot 3ds Max. Are there any questions, Jaime, while I try and recover that?
Nope. You have to come up with something original.
Well, that's okay. I'm doing that. It is, my 3ds Max is behaving very, very badly for me today. Is it better to add a condition for RailClone to judge distances by picking up objects? I'm not 100% sure what that means. Maybe you'd like to elaborate on that question. I'm not quite clear on the use for that. So maybe just let me know there what you mean by that, and I'll try my best to answer it just while 3ds Max opens in the background. Yeah, it is, Amit. It's a typical 3ds Max crash. You're absolutely right. It's all part of the fun. Any tips for realistic animation of the trees?
We have a tutorial on that, right?
Forest Pack. We have.
So find it.
Yeah. So yeah, you'll find some of that. Obviously, Forest Pack doesn't animate the trees itself. So Forest Pack can only sample and randomize the animation of the existing animation that's applied to trees at the moment. So you would need to get animated trees or animate them yourself using grow effects or sequence of meshes or something like that. But it can't do it on its own at the moment. So that would be probably a grow effects tutorial. Sorry?
It's an old one.
It is not.
Guys, I mean, yeah.
Is it the one with the satellite dishes, Jaime?
Yeah, exactly.
It's still relevant. All it's still exactly the same technique, okay, so and exactly the same settings.
This is the tutorial that we are talking about. One huge task that we have in front of us is revamping some of the tutorials that we have out there.
Yeah.
And it's a shame because we're going to lose a lot of views. But for example, the one with the libraries, that has to be redone from scratch. And there's a bunch of another big tutorials which are very popular that we're going to have to ditch and create new ones. But that's life, an evolution.
We have to be remorseless in our ditching of new content. I'm just getting back up to scratch here. Okay, let's see if this works this time. I'm just going to do one tree because this is taking too long. So just bringing in another tree into 3ds Max.
Let me.
I was going to say you have to translate that one.
Yeah, let me answer. La idea es por lo menos cuando saquemos la nueva versión de documentación tenerla nueva entera en español, y estamos estudiando cambiar la UI y tener idiomas incluido español. So there's a question about if it would be possible to have any live stream in Spanish. The first thing that we're going to do for languages is that the new documentation should come out before the end of the year, should be in Spanish, and then we are working on translating the plugins. regarding live streams in Spanish, the thing is that I need Paul to do this, and Paul, it's British, so we have a guy in the company which takes care of support, which is Miguel, and he's a good Spanish speaker. So yeah, we should come out with that pretty soon.
Thanks, Jaime.
And then, as you guys remember, we mentioned before summer that something else that we are working on is to have third-party people in the tutorials. We had Rafa two months ago with the release of RaiClone 6. That was pretty cool. And we have contacted quite interesting people in the industry to be part of the tutorials. We should have some news about that after summer.
Great. Right, Furious Max has just about recovered, and I have the library browser open. I have a user generated folder here, so if I wanted to create a new library in which to add all my trees that I'm importing or whatever from Cosmos or wherever else you're getting them from, then all I need to do is right click on this folder, hit create library and rename it. You don't have to, but it makes sense. Cosmos. And then what I'm going to do is select the tree in the viewport, and then right click in here and click import objects from scene. Just leave the settings all as they are and hit import. I'm aware that I've shown this before, but just to show you that this works with these kinds of assets, it will find all of the various textures and things, and then that will be in your library next time you want to use it. So that's very easy. If you look at the file browser, in the file browser where they've saved those, then you can see this is the directory that's created, and in the maps folder you can see all the textures that were there and the VR mesh as well. So you know that that's going to work from the Forest Pack library, even if you change the paths for the original stuff from Cosmos. So that's pretty cool. Obviously it doesn't grab the thumbnails, but we just get a viewport screen grab instead. So you can easily do that. And I'm just going to risk it and try and import one more tree now, and then show you what I wanted to show you, which is that now in the library we can also add forest sets. So you might have, for example, a collection of related plants. Maybe there are 5 or 6 plants of the same species, and you want to group those together, and you want to be able to add them as a collection of 5 plants, the 5 variations, into your Forest Pack scatter. So rather than have to do them one at a time or to find them in the library browser, we can save them as a forest set, and then we could add that to the library as a set instead of having to add them as individual plants. So let's say we want to add a set of these trees instead of plants. What you do is to create a forest set, which is this little button up here, and just drag that out into the scene, and then we just add the trees to that forest set. So we'll add both of the trees. Now this is just 2, could be 10, could be 10 plant variations, doesn't really matter. And then these forest set would normally be added to the geometry list in Forest Pack, and you would basically be importing 2 or whatever is inside this forest set actually, but 2 trees in this case in one. But what we can do now, as of the latest update, is to add this forest set, including its 2 trees, to the library directly. So we can open the library browser again with the forest set selected there. I'll just right click on it, import objects from scene, leave it all as it is, and hit import. And now what I'm going to get in this is, it will just be the icon, but you can rename it. But what I'm going to have when I import that into a Forest Pack object is a set of 2 trees. Okay, so that's what will happen there. And to use that, it's very easy. So if I was to just delete all these, all I would do is create a new forest object, which it's just doing. Click on the library, and then I could say forest set there, load, and I'll just create a new icon like that, and immediately it will import those 2 trees from the library. So that's pretty cool. Works very quickly, and that's all good. Just seeing somewhere, just some questions there.
Yep. What about the hedge tutorial?
Yeah, I'm wondering which hedge tutorial. Actually, I've got a bit of hedge stuff to talk about later, assuming this all behaves itself. So I can probably talk a little bit about hedges then. So there's an old hedge tutorial where it's about making your own hedges from individual branches. That's maybe something, if you can't get that to work, maybe message us and this might be something obvious, or send us a file or whatever. But now also Forest Pack includes hedge presets, so you might not need that tutorial because there's something built into Forest Pack that works. So Amit is saying, can we have the thumbnails of the assets from forest sets instead of the forest set icon? At the moment, that's not an option. You can go and change the thumbnails though. So you can easily open the library browser, right click and go to properties, and you can upload your own thumbnail easily enough there if you want. So if you don't like the thumbnails, it's just a screen grab, then you can change them if you have the time and dedication to manage your library in that way. So you can certainly do that. Yeah, good. Okay.
So there's a bit of confusion with RB. I understand that what he wants is to know exactly how hedges work, but I'm not sure about that.
Was that hedges? Was he the hedges guy?
Yeah.
Ah, okay. Okay. We'll maybe talk about that when I talk about the hedges later.
Yeah.
Okie dokie. So let me just see what else I wanted to mention about Forest Pack. So Forest Sets supported. Also, so I haven't mentioned it here, and I'm not going to risk it, but Forest LODs are also supported. So if you're using Forest LODs, and it's not too many people that do, but I know there are people out there who use Forest LODs for very big scenes, and you've got, say, 3 level of detail models in there, you can now save that to the library too, which wasn't previously possible. So that possibly makes level of detail more attractive for more users to use, knowing that you can save those as presets. Otherwise, you've got to set them up every time, and it's a bit time consuming. So hopefully that will help speed things up there. Good. Okay. So I'm going to risk opening a bigger scene now and talk a little bit more about some of the changes in forest sets. So let's see if this works. And also wanted to do a general chat about how to organize and lay out scatters that involve kind of woodland scenes and that sort of thing, because there are ways in which you can do that that maybe help you the way you think about it. And I'm sure a lot of people are doing this already, but this for me is the way I think about when I have a kind of scene with woodland in it. This is how I sort of approach it in terms of choosing the models, organizing my scene, and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to load up a scene here, which is just taking a little bit of time. There we go. And it's the scene you can see in the background behind us. So this is a little scene we created yesterday. And I'm starting from nothing. So what I'm going to do basically is to show you a few things. I'm going to show you how I might structure creating the woodland in probably four minimum layers, but possibly more depending on the type of woodland you're trying to create. And then also how I might use forest sets, which are relatively new and I'm not sure have made their way into everyone's workflows yet. Just on a couple of small things, as well as a change to forest sets in this version. So first of all, I wanted to talk to you about these 4 particular layers that I've got here, and it's basically following a kind of understanding of the botany of woodlands. So I think I've got a picture here. Yeah, so basically if you look at woodlands, they're categorized by people that work with forests in various ways, and there's lots of examples of this, but if you Google woodland layers you'll find various like versions, and this is also a kind of succession graph. But so what we end up with basically is the larger trees, which I would call the canopy, and then underneath the canopy you would have shrub or younger trees, and then below that you might have sort of tall plants, shrubs, or smaller than shrubs, sorry, but taller plants, and then underneath that you might have grasses, mosses, that kind of thing. So this photo or this picture here has lots of different layers. I'm just simplifying it massively into 4 here, but the point is that each one kind of it occludes the one below, right? So if there are large trees, they're blocking light getting to the forest floor, which probably means the other things aren't going to grow in abundance directly beneath them. So what we want to look at is how you can use one forest to exclude another. So I'm going to pick the canopy first of all. Now I've already done most of the work here, so the trees and the objects and the plants and everything are already in here, just because I know that this can behave a little bit slowly for me while I'm streaming. It's behaving very slowly for me today. But what I'm going to do is to use a forest set to add the surface, right? Because at the moment I'm just going to build on this surface in the foreground, but later on down the line I might decide that there's 5 or 6 other surfaces in the scene that I want to apply this forest to, and this could be also spline areas or anything else. And what you don't want to get into the situation of is where you've built, maybe I've got 4 layers here, but you might have 8, and then you add an extra surface and you have to add that surface to 8 separate different forest pack objects. That becomes very boring to do that, to go through and select them all. So this is where something like forest sets can come in, because what I can do is I can add a forest set to these forest objects instead, and that will be linked to all the forest objects. And then if I want to then add a surface later, all I need to do is to add it to the set and all the forest pack objects update. So it's really handy. So it's up here again on the icon bar at the top here. I'll just click that, and doesn't matter where I drag it, I'll just drag it into the scene there. And I'll just rename it, call it surface or set surface, so I know what it's called. And then what I want to do is to either add the surfaces to this list by clicking on them, clicking plus here, or, which I think is potentially even more powerful, I can automatically pull in whatever is in a layer in 3ds Max. So this opens up the possibility for you to organize all your scatters and change all your scatters simply by reorganizing your layers and putting objects into layers. So you can see I've got a layer here called FP surfaces. All I need to do is tick from layers here, type FP surfaces to mention the name of that layer, or reference name of that layer, and then I'll come to my forest objects and add this forest surface, this forest set to my surfaces list. So that's, at the moment, that seems like a longer way around of doing things, because I'm only adding one surface to one forest pack object, but this pays off when you start to use that surface in multiple forest pack objects, and you can organize everything much more conveniently. So just waiting for the UI to catch up again. There we go. And I'm going to go into my surface rollout, and now I'm going to add the forest pack set. And there you can see the forest set has the surface in it, and now the trees are on the surface. So that's pretty straightforward. Now what I can do is start to build out the other layers using the same forest set. And this is the point, this is the way I would work, right? From big to small, because without a doubt, these trees have the biggest compositional impact on your scene. Yeah, so it makes sense to deal with those first. And also, from the way that plants grow, they also have the biggest effect on what is going to be growing around and below them. So these are the things you want to start with. We can also, of course, come into the items editor if we want and start moving things around. So maybe we want to delete a few trees to just make this house a bit more visible. So you can do that if you want to as well. Or you can just leave it in generate mode, which I might do for now. Okay, so the next layer down, if you remember our thing, is a kind of undercover or shrub layer. So I'm going to just turn this layer on, and I'm going to use this same surface. Just waiting for the UI to catch up. Yep, it is coming. It's just being very slow. There it goes. Righty-ho. So surface, add the same forest set. There is another option here, actually, which is also the ability to link surfaces through forests. So I could link to the surfaces in one forest object, but I mean, that's the subject for another time. Okay, so now I've got my shrubs in there, but you can see they're not necessarily growing where you'd expect them to grow. They're less likely to grow underneath the trees. There's less light. They'll certainly be smaller. And so we want to exclude those from under the trees. And one of the nice features of Forest Pack is that you can use one Forest Pack as an exclude area for another. So in my areas list, I can click on this little tree button here and then click on the tree forest object, and then that will exclude the shrubs from underneath the trees. So like that, and that works rather well. And you've got a few controls here. You've got a resolution control, so this creates a map from above and projects it downwards. So if you need that to be more accurate, you can increase the size of the resolution, and you can also change the scale of each individual tree's exclusion zone. So it's 100% at the moment. If I wanted to bring the shrubs close to the trees, I could come into 50%. If I wanted to push them further away, I could make it 150%. Like so. I'll go for 125, I think, in this case. Okay, so these are our two main layers. Now there might also be a third or a fourth one later if I wanted to put different layers in, younger trees, different types of large plants. And what I want to do now is just to illustrate that these forest objects can also now be used in a forest set, and then used as that forest set can then be used in an exclude zone in the next layers of plants, because as you like say later on, we might add another forest set, and it's easier to add them. Add another sort of undercover, understory layer, and it's easier to add them to a forest set that updates multiple forest pack objects further down the chain than it is to do them one at a time. So we can go forest set. Forest set. And then I'm just going to basically add these forest pack objects to it. So this is new. We couldn't do this before. It's only possible in the most recent version of Forest Pack. Just going to pick them from the scene. Can't work out what I called them. There we go. Okay, so this time I'm picking them manually. I could also use layers. That would be fine. But this time, just to illustrate there's two different ways of doing it, I'm adding them to the actual list for the set. And now what I can do, if I bring up the next Forest Pack object, which is our field layer, then I can add both those sets to that one, and the two forest objects will exclude, and the surface will then be used for the actual distribution. So just waiting for the UI to update. While I do that, I'll just switch back to chat, see if there's anything being talked about.
There's a question about Forest Pack.
It's good to have some Forest Pack questions.
Yep, that's a good thing.
There's a heart over the top of it, which is very unhelpful because I can't see it. It has a limitation controlling the flow of the thread while creating the, what does that word say? Rugs? Is that right? Through the Forest Pack. I am not 100% sure what that means. I think if there are... Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not sure what that question's about. If there are an image or something you can post a link to that helps to explain it, that might be helpful. But I'm not quite sure what that relates to. Sorry. Okay. Coming back to here, I'm going to add our surface forest set. Now this is shared by 3 forest objects, remember? And I am also going to come into the areas rollout, and this time I'm going to add the forest area and pick the forest set instead of the forests directly. So this will pull in 2 separate forest objects. As I say, this is new in this version of Forest Pack. Just let that update. Helps if you click on it. So, if I just hide the other 2 for a minute, you can see now that the field grass is only where the shrubs and the trees are not. So they're being excluded. Now, I might dial the size in a little bit of these to get them under the trees, like so. Just to add a little bit more. Okay. And now I also wanted to use this as an excuse just to mention that this week we released a new 3D garden collection. So I've got it loaded up here. It is Small Plants 1. So our first collection of small plants. These are all sorts of various small plants here. Each one has 3 different variations, and there's a flowering and a non-flowering version. So these are great for creating your own presets of the kinds of plants that we're going to use here to create big swaths of interesting ground cover. There are a few presets included, but I thought it was more interesting to demonstrate how you'd make your own. So what I've done is I've loaded 4 types of plants in this collection, and just purely for reasons that my computer's behaving very slowly, I've loaded up 2 variations of each here in advance. And what I've done is I've color coordinated the 2 plants that are the same by changing the color ID, right? So you can see it's red, green and blue there. And that just helps me to see what's going on in the scene, for one. But as I think most people probably know, it also lets me do some pretty cool stuff in the distribution rollout, which helps to simulate the way that plants grow in nature, which is clustering. So if I turn on clustering, what I can do is to group together little patches of plants with that have the same color, basically. And you can change the size of these, like so. And you can change the shape as well with roughness. So 0 will create smoother edges. I must stop hitting my microphone. Smoother edges around there, and then the higher that number, the rougher it is. And you can blur the edges so they're not clean, so they bleed into one another, and you can also add a little bit of noise. So this gives you much more naturalistic planting patterns and creates really nice results. It's a really nice collection. Please feel free to have a look at it on our website, and I think Jaime can probably post the link to that, because there is also a free sample you can download and you can add to your library using the techniques we showed you earlier if you'd like to. So that's pretty cool. The other thing I wanted to mention there, let me just turn down my max items to 0 so you can see this a little bit better. The other thing I wanted to mention is that it's quite a handy tip, is that if you've got a scatter like this and you want to create gaps as part of the distribution, I do this all the time, and I know you've probably watched tutorials where I do this, but just in case you haven't, just to mention it, what you can do if you want to create little patches, because these patches here, right, these patches are just because there's bushes and trees on top of them. That's why those patches are there. So what we want is some patches in the middle, maybe, to break this up a little bit. And one way you can do that is to add a new item here, and we'll just set it to disabled once it's loaded up. Once it's done, thank you, Jaime. Set it to disabled, yeah, exactly. And you see it's got a different color again. So because it's got a different color, it's going to be treated as a different gap in this, as a different patch, a cluster in this algorithm. So what you can do then is you can control the probability setting to change how many of those gaps, or the size of those gaps in that scatter. So if I turn that down to 0, you'll get more. If I turn it up to 100, you'll get less. The other thing I can do is to churn down the probability if I want even more gaps of the existing plants, so that will introduce a different kind of distribution. So I can change these to 20, for example. You can see I've got a much more gappy kind of distribution now. The only thing I like to do when I'm using that technique, though, is just to make sure that in my distribution settings the noise setting isn't too high. If it's too high, then what you'll end up with is something like this, where you're getting lots of little gaps introduced everywhere, and you start to lose the kind of the clustering a little bit. So I would just set that down to something quite low. Lovely. And then the final layer is going to be just your ground cover layer, and so that's the grass, which is here, and it will use the same 2 forest sets as the previous 2. So I'm just going to let the UI catch up with that and check the chat while that's doing it. It seems to be the most efficient way of doing things. So how does the different distribution of objects look? Does that render? Okay. So I'm not rendering deliberately, because as you can see, my computer is behaving dreadfully today, and rendering at the same time is seriously not a good idea. But let me see. I think somewhere I have got. So okay. So this one behind this image here is how this looks. Okay. So Okay, there's a big bar across it, but you can see there is the trees, there's the bushes around the sides, and then we've got the field plants, which is the new collection, and then you've got the grass underneath that. Okay, so that's
Paul, you have on the screen, Paul.
Yeah,
you have on the screen you were talking and you were having on the screen the chat.
That's all right. I've switched it. It's just a bit behind on on YouTube.
Okay.
Yeah, it's all right.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. So here we go. We've got our grass, and so what we want to do is to come into surfaces again, set this up. So we want to add the surface to the surfaces list. This is just repetition now, so let's do this quickly. And then the areas list, we want to exclude those two tall plants, the trees and the shrubs again. So we can do that by using the forest area set, the new forest area set that was only possible with this version. And then it should all work beautifully. Okay, so just add that, and there we go, that's working. If I put the other things back on, then we would have our complete system. And that works pretty well. And the cool thing is it's all updates live. So in theory, once I was to update the trees, all the other 4 layers would update, and that would be cool. So just wait for Max to catch up with me. So Lars is, yeah, okay, thanks Lars. Yes, the probability. So we are currently, this is useful information, Lars, and I would urge anyone else at the moment to switch chat while I talk about this. So Lars is saying that he doesn't understand why the probability settings are so far from the list of items, because you have to scroll down in order to change the probability and scroll back up again. So we are, and it's okay to say this, I think, Jaime, in the process of basically looking at the entire Forest Pack user interface. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
So anything like that, any niggles, things you'd like to see changed, things you'd think could be improved about the organization of the Forest Pack interface are all very useful information for us. So please let us know. You can just email us or let us know on the forum or drop a message in the chat now, even if you like, and we'll aggregate it all together and pay attention to what you're saying and make some changes. Okay.
It's very important what Paul just said. Okay, I mean, if you guys can any feedback that you guys can send in, it will be more than welcome, because we're going to be looking at the whole UI.
Yeah.
After summer. Yeah, and there's some major decisions to be made. So any feedback that we can have from you users, I mean, it would be great.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So yeah, so I'm back in the scene just quickly. I just wanted to illustrate that this whole thing's editable live. So if I adjust the trees, then you can see everything is updating. All 4 layers here are being affected by this one thing. And that's because they're all linked together thanks to the forest sets, thanks to the ability to link one forest pack inside another, and so on and so forth. And the other thing I wanted to illustrate was just how the fact that now I have the forest set for the surfaces attached to 4 separate forest pack objects, and it could be more than that, how that can save me time, because let's say I will now want to apply this forest object, or all 4 of these forest objects, to this one surface at the back here. In theory, all I need to do is to come into my layers, because remember this forest set is looking at a layer, and I need to drag my surface into that new layer, and it should automatically populate that scene like so. And if it doesn't for some reason, it might just need a manual build, so we'll just build it by coming into the forest lister and hitting the build button, and that might just update the trees. There we go. So that's a much quicker way of updating things than would be the case if you had to go and adjust those directly. And you know, it's a nice quick way of building entire biomes that are interconnected and easy to add new surfaces and areas and so forth to. So forest sets can basically be used now anywhere where a forest pack accepts an input for geometry or surfaces, or well, basically anything that's in the scene can now be added to a forest set and used inside forest pack. So it's very, very handy. Good. Okie dokie.
One question from Gustapia. Is it possible to order the vegetation as shown in image of the section from smart to larger?
Is it possible to order the vegetation and show in the image from small to large? So yeah, I'm not 100%. So you could potentially do that. I'm not 100% sure what you mean, but the way it's been done here with smaller to larger is just the sort of, so the smaller ones are all, there's always large ones which are occluding the small ones. So it's basically it's large ones, and then around the large ones we've got the medium-sized ones, and around the medium-sized ones we've got the the small-ish ones, and then around those you've got the smallest ones. So there's a hierarchy there, and it's controlled that way. And so in a way, by controlling the hierarchy, like by moving the trees or the shrubs around, I affect the way that the size of the plants cascades down. So if I wanted, for compositionally, for there to be more shrubs in the mid-ground, then I could just paint them in, and then around those you would end up with the medium, the slightly smaller plants, and in front of those the smaller plants again. So this whole lot's kind of configurable in that way. And another option would be to write, if you wanted kind of like a gradient going back of small plants in the foreground, medium, large, very large, then you could certainly do things like that too, based on distance to areas and so on and so forth. That's all possible. And of course we've also got the ability to scale plants based on their relative position to include and exclude areas, which I think I have set up on some of these, but you can use graphs to basically control the density and the scale based on how close they are to one another. So I would show you, but this scene is behaving very slowly for me, so I'm loath to try it. Okay. So let me think. There was a question this week. Actually, 3 questions came in, which were all the same. And were interesting because they were about something that's been there for quite a long time, and I think it's worth mentioning just in case people aren't aware of it, which is basically how to quickly select in Forest Pack the objects that Forest Pack uses. So if you've got trees, for example, like I've got the trees object here, how do I select the trees that it's linked to? Maybe how do I select the surfaces and so on and so forth? Or also, how do I select everything so I can maybe export the entire Forest Pack object, including all the necessary parts of the scene that it depends on, to another file? And you can do that in the right-click menu. So if you right-click on a Forest Pack object, you can see here we've got a few options, such as select forest custom object, select forest surface, select forest area, and also select all forest dependencies. So that will help you to basically pick everything that you need that makes that Forest Pack object work. So in this case, it's quite a simple one, 3 objects, but it could be 80, And then you could just go to Files, Save Selected, and you've saved that Forest Pack object out separately. Maybe you're extracting it in as a scene or something like that instead. So it's there. It's in the right-click menu. The same, really, if you wanted to just select the areas, one of the areas that it's used, rather than fishing around in the scene or the layers panel for it. You could right click on the forest object and then just pick it from a list, which when it eventually opens I will show you. There we go. So you could click select forest areas, and then it will normally bring up a list, unless I'm not using any, which I'm not in this case. So select forest surface, for example. There's only one, so it selected it immediately. So it's a quick way of kind of selecting bits and bobs, and RailClone has an equivalent too. So it's a nice, fast way of picking things. So I just wanted to mention that one just very, very quickly in passing. Chat. I would like the ability to be able to turn on off the tooltips. Yes, okay, that's fine. We'll feed that back. The reason they were turned off originally was because, as our speed in the UI, thanks to Max being a bit clunky, is a little bit slow. So we sacrificed the tooltips for redraw speed, basically. It'd be cool if you could see the name of the set or setup at their icons. That's a nice suggestion. Thank you, Lars. That's true. Yeah, that would be cool. Okay. Coming back to here. Screen. I thought I changed screen. Anyway, possibly not. Let's now go to a new topic, which is back to RailClone for a little bit. A nice straightforward one. how to create tiling patterns with offset rows in RailClone. This was a question, and this particular the tiling pattern on the back wall here was the question being asked. But it's a question that comes up quite a few times, and it's basically a simple offset brick pattern, right? It's one brick with another one halfway across it. But we get asked it again and again. So I thought I'd show you, but with this tiling pattern, and also to show you a slightly different way of doing it that uses one of the changes in the new conditional operator. Just a small thing, but maybe it's a new tip for you. So let me see. Running bond variations. Okay, so this can be built from one style, one tile. I'll just switch to desktop so you can see it as it loads. Did I not switch for the right click stuff? Oh, I'm so sorry. I will show you again another time. Okie dokie. So very simple style. I've got a tile here. This one is actually not needed, so I'll delete that. So I've got one tile and I've got a spline, and I'm just going to build this into that pattern. So a RailClone object's what we need. Just going to draw that in the scene and open the style editor. And I want to bring in that spline and that segment. So just for a bit of fun, new in RailClone 6, I can select objects in the scene, of course, because the style editor no longer now needs to be active. I can right click and I can just hit import scene selection, and that will bring in my segment and my spline. That's quicker than doing them individually, I think you'll agree. And then we want a 2D array. So we're going to fill this spline. So we want a 2D array, and I'm going to wire the rectangle to the clipping area input. Go to the generator settings, scroll down and choose extend XY size to area. Go to tile hole, I don't need to pick it, it's already there, and wire it to the default input. So that's what we're left with, which is okay. Okay, so basically there's two things to worry about here. One is that I obviously need to close up the gap here above, and the other is that I need to offset every other row by half the width of the tile. It could be a brick, could be anything else. So there's a ton of ways of doing it, but let's show you this way today. First of all, I'm going to export the padding for the bottom, I think. Bottom padding, could be a top, doesn't matter. Bottom padding, and I'm going to wire a constant node to that so that I can control the padding from here. And that's because I'm going to need to use that value elsewhere in a second. I'm going to set scene units. And we just want to bring this padding down a little bit. So it's going to be a negative number, negative 2.45, I think was about the right value. And that just draws that down. So that's fine. So we also want to do every other row. So let's see, how can we do this? Let's export the width of the tile. I could hard code the width of the tile, but then if I changed the tile later on, I'd have to then go back into the style and hard code a different value and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to do instead is to export the attributes and go to size X. So I've got the width of the tile. So now I want to divide that in half. So if you go into macros, into here, where it says arithmetic, you see there's an option that says divide by n. So that is set up to divide by 2 automatically, but you can divide by any number, and it just, if I double click on it, it's very simple, but it just saves you a few nodes. And then also I need to turn this into a negative rather than a positive. So also in the macros there's a negate value macro, so I can just wire that into there. Like so. So that's okay. I've now got a negative value of half the width of the tile. So now what I need to do is to wire that into the left padding for the first tile in every other row. And what I'll do is to use a conditional operator for that. So I'll come into the normal items again, come to the conditional operator, wire it in. And actually I'm going to wire this one into false. There we go. And now I need to add a transform node and turn on override padding. And now I'm going to export the padding for the bottom again, because don't forget we're bottom padding over here, and I'm going to override it otherwise. And also the left. so I can move it over to the left a little bit. So there's that. Same segment, and then I'll wire that to the true input. We won't see anything happen yet because I haven't got any conditions set up. So what I want to do is wire the bottom padding to the bottom padding, and I want to wire this little equation that we've got here to the left input of that. Don't forget to turn override padding on, which it is, and now I can come into the conditional node. So the small change that's here is the drop down combine mode and or. Okay, so we've got and or options there. And what we want to do is to use and probably. So what I'm going to do is to change the segment X counter, turn that on so that it equals 1. Right, so that's basically saying if it's the first segment in each row, then use the one that's got the left padding negative half the width. And you can see that's worked. It's pulled the tile over half its width. That's okay, but we only want it to do it every other row. So I can come into conditional again, turn on Y counter, and turn on multiple of 2. So that's kind of working, except that obviously this is set to or, I think, at the moment. Or, so if it's either the first one or it's a multiple of 2, it's going to use the one with the padding. So what we want to do is change this, and this is a new RailClone thing. Change this to and. Change to and there we go. Now we have it working, because now it's doing only when it's the first segment on every other row. It pulls over the padding on those. So that's very quick and easy, and shows you how quickly you can set up tiles like that. There are loads of other ways of doing that, but this way just shows you the new conditional and or options up there, which may have passed people by. Lovely. How are we doing for time, Jaime?
Well, we are all over the hour, so...
Oh, okay. Well, I had a few more I wanted to do. Do you mind if I just do 2 more?
Yeah, sure. We have a question from from Vishal Chandran.
I had a doubt while using layered lawns in Forest Pack. When we set the grass to limit at boundary, it doesn't exactly align with the boundary. Unlike single plants, it comes off as patchy at the border. Okay. Yeah. So you've got 2 options there. I'm assuming you say what you want is edge trimming mode, probably. Extend past the size of the boundary, but you'll still end up with a rough edge. Or you can use edge trimming mode, which will extend them slightly past the boundary and then cut the grass off there. And so that's the mode you probably want to do. If I can get Forest Pack to behave itself in this particular version, or this particular problem I'm having today with my resources, then I'll show you where that setting is. But there's a tutorial about it, right? If you look up edge trimming, or Jaime can post it in there, there's an edge trimming tutorial that shows you how that works, and I assume that's what you're talking about. In Corona, you may need to run the material, if it's not one of our built-in libraries, you may need to run the material optimizer tool, which is in the material rollout, which is here, optimize materials, because what this will do is it will add a map that you need to your Corona materials automatically in order to use edge trimming. If it's V-Ray, you don't need to do that. In V-Ray, all you need to do is to turn on edge trimming, which is here, basically. It's grayed out at the moment because I haven't got an edge there, but you can see it's edge trimming mode here. So just turn that on. And that's basically it. Rightio. So I'm going to go for the safer option first. I need to certainly do the one that's in the image that we used to promote this live stream, which is this bridge. I'm not doing the whole bridge. The question was just about these struts here. So how to create this effect where you've got struts bridging from one curve to another curve, because RailClone doesn't really have that ability at the moment to use a top and bottom spline and interpolate between them. So what I'm going to do is show you how to do that using Max's modifier stack and RailClone, and also a small change in 3ds Max recently. It's actually made this a little bit easier. So I'll just show you how that works quickly. And I think this has got a lot of interesting applications for various things. Okie dokie. So I'll just switch back to desktop and just loading this up. So this is a simplified version of the file, but you can see how it would basically work. Need materials. Okay, here we go. So it's a very simplified version of the scene. Okay, but just to illustrate that I've made the starts and the ends different on these struts, and you can go in at any point and keep it fully parametric. So it's quite a handy trick, and some of you probably do this already, but others may not. Okay, so what you would do basically is I'll start from scratch because it's an easy one. Create a spline. And then we'll just come into here and just set, in this case I'm just going to set all the vertices to smooth. And the other thing I'm going to do is to set the material ID of this particular spline to 2. Right, so this is a material ID of 2, and the reasons for that will become obvious. So I'm going to make a clone of that, and make sure the material ID is also 2, and then maybe I'll create my new shape here. So let's make that kind of bridge shape. It's this sort of shape, right? Okay, so we end up with something like that. So this will form the basis for our creating these cross sections here. And what we're going to do to make this parametric is basically add a normalized spline modifier to this. I'm going to turn on show knots so we can see them, and I'm going to set it to not count because these are different lengths, these splines. So if I leave it on segment length, I'll end up with different number of knots on each spline, which won't work. So I'm just going to leave it like that. That's fine. And then we can also then add a cross section modifier to this, and that will join those vertices up like that. So you can see how easy this is. Now, the nice thing about that now is that the newly created splines will default back to material ID 1, and the original splines should retain material ID 2. Now, if you're in older versions of Max, that may not be the case, but in Max 2024, it seems to retain them. So now what I want to do is to create the RailClone style to go with that. There's really nothing to that at all. What I'll do is just create the RailClone object. Like so. I'm going to select these 3 things. Oh, I should open the style editor first, sorry. Yes, 3 curves could be used too. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It will bridge across 3. Okay. So I'm going to select the 2 sections that I need and the spline, and this little shortcut again, import scene selection. There we go. And then we can use a linear array. Connect the spline to the spline input. I'm going to connect the mid part to the default input. It's sort of working now, as you can see. I'm going to select the end and connect it to start. That's working there. I'm going to connect the end to the end as well. That needs to be mirrored, as you can see here. So I'll mirror that like so. So that's fine. And then because remember we set the material IDs up, what I can do is go to the linear generators limits setting and click material ID, so it only uses splines with a material ID of 2. And there you go. That's basically it. Nice and quick. I might also set the Z alignment to center. But you can basically build some really interesting things with this. And the nice thing is you can go back and edit at any point, so I can easily come back once that's been built and change the shape of the curves however I want. Doesn't have to be quite so linear as that. And you can also change the number of cross sections at any point just by changing the normalized spline modifier, like so. So yeah, pretty handy technique. I've used it for a lot of things in the past. I think you can explore it a little bit. We have got in mind the idea of a generator that uses 2 parallel splines. There's the idea of using 3, just to illustrate that you can do that. And that's sort of in the roadmap somewhere as well. So you know, it might be a short-lived workaround, this one. But for now, that is a way of doing this sort of thing. I hope that's helpful. And then I think I'm going to check in. We did have an awesome hedges question. Now, I wanted to do this with basically doing a lot of renders to show how you can change the materials from one of our standard hedges to get this autumn hedge. Now, I am a little bit mindful of the fact that I don't think my PC is going to behave itself if I'm trying to do renders. So what I'm going to do is pre-record that one, and we'll release it next week or something maybe, because I think that will be a nice little tutorial anyway, and I think it will be much clearer and easier to understand if I can actually use, you know, interactive rendering to illustrate how that works. Yeah. Instead, maybe I'll do this one, and then we'll finish off with this little Forest Pack tutorial. So this might look RailClone, but it's Forest Pack. Okay, so this was a question about creating this kind of rotated brick facade, and they wanted to use maps to do it. Originally it was a kind of RailClone question, but RailClone doesn't support maps on surfaces for affecting transforms. But in the end, we used Forest Pack instead. So that question there. Looking forward to that tutorial. Thank you all. I will do it as soon as. While we're using cameras, use current camera option. The Forest Pack behind the camera is totally hidden. If it's not. So yeah. So it's logical that a Forest Pack is behind the camera. So the question is, if you're using camera culling in Forest Pack, and you've got use current camera enabled, which would use whatever camera you're looking through, the trees behind you disappear, and that is logical because they're behind the camera, so they can't be seen. Of course, I assume in this case the problem was that it affects reflections, probably in the glass. So I think in that case, if you've got trees you need in reflections, you need to turn off the camera for those ones. Or there is in Forest Pack otherwise the ability to draw the cone that's used back some distance behind the camera, so that you still end up with the trees behind you in reflections. So that's another possibility, but there's not an automatic way of doing that. Okay, so switching back to desktop. So I've got a just simple spline. This was the sample file I was kind of sent, and I've got a brick. It's very good, isn't it? It's a sophisticated scene. What we want to do is to basically populate this wall with this brick. And again, you wouldn't think it's logically a Forest Pack task, but it can be done. So what I'm going to do is basically create a Forest Pack object, and I'm initially just going to do it in icon mode, right? Because I want to illustrate something, which is that if you're going to scatter with Forest Pack on a vertical surface like this, then the forest object needs to be rotated to match the alignment of that surface. So that Forest Pack object needs to be turned up like that, and then it will work fine. And once you've done that, you can just use it as normal, but you do need to rotate it first. And then we can simply add that spline as an area to Forest Pack and add that brick. So that's nice and easy. Just waiting for the UI to catch up. Here we go. So let's add that spline. Yeah, there's a question just while I'm waiting for that to load up. There was a question about sharing. We can't share that file, I'm afraid, because we don't own the copyright for it. So I'm afraid we're limited by what we can share a little bit. Geometry. I'm just going to add
That
the
said,
brick.
Paul,
Yeah.
that said, little announcement. We are going back to, we used to release free scenes back in the days, like 10 years ago. And we are working on bringing that back. We think that's quite interesting for users to have access to scenes built. I mean, we are not 3D artists, of course. We are software developers, but there's the idea of bringing back same way we did with forced colors and that kind of stuff in the past, to have back again free scenes so you guys can play with.
Yeah. That's
Yep.
a good point. Yeah, we plan to give away more. Exactly. Okay, so I'm just setting up the brick pattern here. Now there's a few things. Obviously, Forest Pack is designed to scatter in slightly chaotic, naturalistic ways, which the brick wall isn't. And so by default, the map is not the one we want, which is dense. So that's the default map. Now there is somewhere in here, I think it's grid 2. There is this kind of, you can just see it's kind of offset rows pattern, and that will give you something a little bit better. Now we can close this down like this, and you can see that's basically a brick wall pattern. So that's grid 2 that will give you that. And if, as in this, well, it looks okay actually. If you need to close up the rows whilst not closing up the distance between the bricks horizontally, then what you do then is to turn off lock aspect ratio, and then you can control the two separately. So I can start to close up the rows like that, just to get the pattern a bit better. Like so. So there's your basic brick wall pattern. Nothing complicated there particularly. So what we need to do now is to control that somehow, and the way we can do that is in the transform rollout. I'm sure probably many of you have guessed this already. So what you do basically is to turn on randomized rotation and immediately set these values to 0, because that's mayhem. And then we need to find the axis that we want to control. And I know from having done this that it's the y-axis, so there it is. Okay, so that's fine. So we want to set in the maximum value the most we want the bricks to come out. So I'm going to put 25 degrees for now, like that. And it's randomizing, okay? So that's not what we want, but we want to be able to control it. And the user actually had I think a hand-painted map, I think. Might be wrong. But we can do it with a noise map for now. So what I'm going to do is turn on maps there. And in the map option here, I'm just going to click on that and add a noise map. In general, just use the standard noise. You could use any of the noise maps. You could use the OSL noise maps, whatever. I'm just using standard noise maps here for now. Okay, so there we have our noise map. And now what we want to do is to edit it a little bit, because at the moment it's just not quite doing what we want. So we can open up the material editor. Let's see if I can put this somewhere we can see all of these things. Pop the noise map into there. And then I'm just going to, yeah, that should be instanced. So hopefully I can change that. So I think the size is probably not going to be too bad. I might drop it down to 50. But what I am going to do is to, in order to better kind of match the style that we had before, is change the mode to fractal, and then change the tiling on the y-axis to maybe 2, something like that. And we can start to see that having some sort of effect. And now what I want to do is to come in and just play with the curves a little bit, see if I can get a better effect. And then it's just a case of playing with these. But the basic point is that you can control the rotation like this with a map, and to get these kinds of effects. Yeah, you can see that's kind of working now. We're getting that kind of effect. So you can play with the scale, the size, or you can hand paint your own maps. But basically what's happening is the black and white is controlling the rotation now, from black 0 to white being, at this point, 25 degrees. We could go a bit more if you want to see that a little bit more pronounced. You can see how that kind of is working. Maybe I'll change the tiling to 0.2, stretch it out a little bit. That looks a bit more like it. So yeah, so this kind of thing is possible. Just to show you the reference again. Nope, I'm finding all the other ones we're not going to have time to do. There it is, rotated bricks. So you can see how that kind of could be done, basically. Good.
There's a comment about the latest array modifier for 3ds Max having some challenge for RaiClone. Well, I mean, we are aware it does the basic stuff, but obviously it's way far from RaiClone capabilities. So
yeah, it's a threat for our free clone plugin. And it's got, and it's a bit more advanced than that, but it's not near RailClone. I actually think there's interesting opportunities to use the clone plugin with RailClone and combine the two rather than thinking of them as kind of competitors. So, I mean, that could be the subject for some content in the future, in fact. But I think they're a different, level, really. Now, the 3 curve example, can the center curve also have the mid and end segments? So this is Amit. He means 3 curves having end, mid, end, mid, end, mid. Can you please show it live in this session? Okay, just to finish up, I should be able to do that because I think I've got a version of that scene which has it already done. So let me just see. So it should be possible just by modifying the RailClone graph a bit, because the middle one I think will be considered as a corner. So we can then treat that as a corner and target that in the RailClone style with whatever geometry you want, basically. So I think let's just take this spline and just recreate what I think you're talking about here. Yep, so I switch to desktop. Here we go. Okay, so I'm just going to take this spline here and I'm just going to clone it out so that we've got the 3 splines. I'm not worrying too much about the shape. Okay, so at the moment, as you can see, it clearly isn't a separate spline because it's being beveled there. So that's a corner spline there. Now, that means, in theory, we can target that with geometry. So let's see what I can do. I'll just open the graph editor here. Okay, so you can see we've got a corner input here. So what I can do is, just trying to see everything all at once, add a compose node to the corner input, like so, and then we can add the end, so this mirror to the first one of those inputs. We can add it to the end as well, and then maybe what we'll do is to add just a transform in the middle and turn on override fixed size and increase that size. So that will basically add a little bit of a gap between them in theory. So you can see that's pulling it apart a little bit. Now what I want to do is to come into the corner settings and turn on bevel corner. Right. So you can see the transform operator there, and just needs to be between those 2 sections. There we go. So now I can pull that apart or put it back together. Depends how much gap you want there. And you've got a start and an end joining each spline, each section of the spline. So I hope that answers that question. But yes, it's possible, but you're not using start and end. You're just using corner instead, and you're using a compose operator to kind of create that effect. But of course, that's going to work no matter how many splines I add now. So we've done 3, but it could be any number. Of course, when you're using the cross-section modifier, the order in which you create the splines is important because it joins them in that order. So you need to be aware of that when you're creating those splines. But yeah, you can see that's working. Lovely, and I think that's probably all the time we've got.
It is, in fact. I'm sorry to play buttercup as usual, but we have to wrap up.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming. Sorry about the slightly chaotic live stream today. I do need to try and sort this out so that it is a lot less sluggish, basically. But I will, as promised, record that other tutorial and release it in the next week or so that you can see that.
We'll make it natural that way, Paul.
Sorry?
We'll make it natural that way. Yeah, people have to realize we're humans and, you know, our computers crash.
Yeah, well, it's just more the speed, really. But if you know, I think yeah, anyway, people don't need to know why I'm having problems with the speed of my computer. But basically, streaming, zooming, chroma key, and running 3ds Max is not agreeing with my processor. So that's the problem. But we'll see what we can do. And thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. I did have some extra questions which I will carry over till next week, or if I think there's enough to them, I will release a tutorial about them. I might make a tutorial also about the scene we saw at the beginning with the different layers of the forest, because I think that's worth elaborating on probably, and make that be useful for new users. And send us feedback on things you'd like to see changed in Forest Pack UI, or anything else you'd like to let us know about how you use Forest Pack and what works for you and what doesn't, because this is a point at which we're really reappraising everything in terms of where we go with Forest Pack next. So any feedback on that is really helpful. And you can, as always, talk to us on the forum or social media or anywhere really. We're always happy to talk. Yep. Anything to add before we say goodbye?
It's happy summer to everyone.
Yeah.
You know, enjoy the temperatures. Here in Spain, it's been hard, and let me tell you, but we'll talk to everyone in a month.
Yeah. See you next month.
Yep. Thanks a lot, man. Cheers.